Hello, everyone. Welcome to Deep Sight. Let us take you on a continued exploration of European history, a year when Europe burned in unison. Imagine this historical tableau. In the spring of 1848, from Paris to Berlin, from Vienna to Milan, from Prague to Budapest, almost the entire European continent erupted in flames of political protest within the span of just a few short weeks. Kings fled in haste, prime ministers resigned in disgrace, and ordinary people in the streets felt, for the very first time, that history, it seemed, could truly be rewritten by their own hands. That year witnessed a wave of simultaneous revolutions, unprecedented in human history, spanning the widest geographical area and involving the greatest number of participants to date. Later historians would collectively dub these events the revolutions of 1848, while others, with a more poetic flourish, would refer to them as the springtime of the peoples. This latter appellation is rich in metaphor. Spring signifies the reawakening of all things, a moment when long-suppressed energies finally burst forth from the soil. Yet spring is also fleeting, often followed closely by a long and bitter political winter. So, from where, precisely, did this revolution originate? What distinct forms did it assume across the various corners of Europe? Why did this massive movement ultimately end in failure in almost every locale? And perhaps the most intriguing question of all, to what extent did a failed revolution actually alter the trajectory of history? Today, let us trace the threads of history and step together into this year, the most turbulent, yet also the most vibrant, in the annals of European history. Before delving into the narrative itself, it is essential to first understand the broader historical context in which this revolution unfolded. In 1815, following the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, Europe's major powers convened in Vienna, under the leadership of Austrian Chancellor Metternich, to redraw the continent's political map. The core logic underpinning this Congress was one of restoration and equilibrium, to bottle up once again the forces of liberalism and nationalism unleashed by the French Revolution, to reinstate the authority of monarchical rule, and to maintain a balance of power among the great nations. Yet the wheels of history do not cease to turn simply to accommodate the wishes of politicians. Over the ensuing 30 years, the tide of the Industrial Revolution quietly reshaped Europe's social fabric. An emerging urban middle class and working class steadily expanded, while national consciousness flourished through the writings of intellectuals. Economic volatility and political repression allowed social tensions to accumulate to a critical breaking point. The year 1848 marked precisely this critical juncture. 2. France, the epicenter of revolution, and how it ignited all of Europe. The demise of the July Monarchy, a revolution sparked by a banned banquet. The story begins in Paris, for it was the spark struck in France that first illuminated the entire European continent. In February 1848, the political atmosphere in Paris was already fraught with tension. Since ascending to the throne in 1830, King Louis Philippe had presided over what came to be known as the July Monarchy. The king styled himself the Citizen King, theoretically representing the interests of French constitutionalism and the middle class. However, his government was rife with corruption, and suffrage remained firmly restricted to a wealthy few. Out of a French population of 35 million, a mere 240,000 possessed the right to vote. The vast majority of urban residents, workers, and the petite bourgeoisie were effectively barred from the political sphere. The opposition devised a unique form of protest, the banquet campaign. Since public assemblies and petitions were strictly curtailed, reformers organized political banquets as a means to gather the public, deliver speeches, and advocate electoral reform. This movement swept across the nation with formidable momentum. Eventually, Prime Minister Guizot issued an order banning a large-scale banquet scheduled to take place in Paris on February 22, 1848. This decision served as the fuse that ignited the revolution. Following the issuance of the ban, enraged citizens of Paris took to the streets. On the night of February 23rd, a detachment of soldiers opened fire on the crowd, leaving dozens dead. As news of the incident spread, the entire city erupted. By the following morning, barricades had been erected throughout Paris. The National Guard, the very armed force charged with maintaining order, began to defect en masse, refusing to carry out the crackdown. Realizing that the tide had turned decisively against him, Louis Philippe hastily signed his abdication decree, changed into civilian clothes, and fled to England in a hired carriage. Thus, a revolution, ignited by the banning of a banquet, overthrew the French monarchy in a mere 3 days, and the Second French Republic was proclaimed. News of the French February Revolution spread across Europe with astonishing speed. In an era devoid of telephones, telegraphs, or radio broadcasts, the news nonetheless reached every major city within a matter of days. For the people of Vienna, Berlin, Milan, and Budapest, the French Revolution served as a signal, a proof that change was, in fact, truly possible. Rifts within the Republic, different people, different dreams of a republic. However, from the very moment of its inception, the nascent Second French Republic carried within itself a fatal internal contradiction. The ranks of the revolution were composed of people from diverse social strata. While they had stood shoulder to shoulder at the barricades to topple the old dynasty, they held starkly different visions of what a republic ought to be. For the commercial and industrial bourgeoisie, a republic signified constitutional order, the protection of property rights, and a stable business environment no longer subject to the arbitrary interference of an autocratic monarch. They desired reform, yet they did not wish for the revolution to go too far, and certainly did not want the existing social structure to be completely upended. For the middle class, comprising professionals such as lawyers, doctors, and professors, a republic meant freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and expanded rights to political participation, yet they too harbored a deep-seated obsession with order. The demands of the hundreds of thousands of urban workers and artisans in Paris, however, were entirely different. They labored under abysmal conditions for meager wages, lived in overcrowded slums, and possessed absolutely no form of social safety net. For them, a republic had to address their livelihood. It had to be a republic that genuinely cared for the poor. In an effort to appease the workers, the provisional government established national workshops to provide employment and relief for the unemployed. At their peak, these workshops registered well over 100,000 workers. It was a costly undertaking, one that would ultimately become the focal point of future conflicts. Blood and fire in June, a repression that tore France apart. In June 1848, the crisis finally erupted in the most violent manner imaginable. Citing fiscal pressures, the newly elected National Assembly announced the closure of the national workshops and demanded that workers either enlist in the army or leave Paris to undertake drainage projects in the provinces. For those workers who viewed the national workshops as their sole source of livelihood, this decree amounted to nothing less than a declaration of war. From June 23rd to 26th, a massive armed uprising broke out in the working-class districts of eastern Paris. Workers once again erected barricades and engaged in fierce street fighting against government troops. The National Assembly granted General Louis Cavaignac full powers, mobilizing regular army units and provincial National Guard forces to carry out a brutal suppression of the revolt. By the time the fighting ended, approximately 1,500 people had died in the street battles. The death toll climbed even higher during the subsequent wave of arrests and executions, and thousands more were exiled to Algeria. This event, known to history as the June Days Massacre, left an unhealed scar upon French society. It starkly revealed a fundamental truth. Even under the banner of a republican system, conflicts of interest between different social groups could still escalate into violent confrontation. For the bourgeois republicans, the repression was a necessary measure to preserve order. Yet for the working class, the blood spilled in June would forever stand as a symbol of the Republic's betrayal. Consequently, French society descended into a state of profound political exhaustion and mutual mistrust. The rise of Louis Napoleon, the illusion of order, and the return of empire. Following the suppression of the June uprising, the societal yearning for stability and order eclipsed all else. It was precisely within this atmosphere that a name, shrouded in an aura of mystique, emerged onto the political stage: Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the nephew of Napoleon I and a longtime exile abroad, possessing no distinguished personal record in politics. Yet he possessed an irreplaceable political asset: his name. In the memories of many French people, the era of Napoleon represented order, glory, and strength. Louis Napoleon meticulously cultivated his public image, claiming to represent the interests of all French people rather than those of any single class. His campaign propaganda spanned both urban and rural areas, appealing to a broad electorate: peasants, workers, and members of the bourgeoisie who had grown weary of political turmoil. The results of the presidential election in December 1848 left everyone astounded. Louis Napoleon was elected with over 74% of the vote, a figure that dwarfed the combined totals of all his rival candidates. Subsequently, in December 1851, he staged a coup d'état to dissolve the National Assembly. The following year, he established the Second French Empire, proclaiming himself Napoleon III. Thus, France's Republican experiment of 1848 came to an end within a mere 3 years, giving way once again to imperial rule. Historians continue to debate the significance of this outcome. Some view it as a crushing defeat for French democracy. Others argue that, given the historical context, Louis Napoleon's victory rested upon profound social foundations. His triumph reflected the alienation of France's vast rural population from radical urban politics, as well as society's desperate yearning for stability after prolonged upheaval. In any event, France's experience clearly illustrates a central paradox of the revolutions of 1848. The political space opened up by a revolution is not necessarily filled by the revolutionaries themselves. A lasting legacy, historical transformation under imperial rule. Although the establishment of the Second Empire marked the end of the Republican experiment initiated in 1848, France did not cease its historical transition toward a modern democratic society. During the reign of Napoleon III, France underwent rapid industrialization and urbanization. The massive renovation of Paris, spearheaded by Baron Haussmann, fundamentally transformed the city's physical landscape. Concurrently, the political consciousness awakened in 1848, manifested in demands for universal suffrage, workers' rights, and the ideals of a republican system, never truly went dormant. The Paris Commune of 1871 represented another eruption of these latent forces, while the eventual establishment of the Third French Republic in 1875 signaled the definitive triumph of the republican system in France. In a sense, the seeds sown in 1848, though taking root belatedly, ultimately blossomed and bore fruit upon the soil of France with enduring resilience. 3. Germany, the dream of unification and the frustration of liberal politics. A divided nation, why Germans so deeply yearned for unification. To understand the German Revolution of 1848, one must first grasp the fundamental political landscape of the German world in the mid-19th century, a confusing and intricate mosaic. At that time, Germany was not a unified nation-state, but rather a loosely knit German confederation comprising 38 states of varying sizes. These states were each ruled by their own kings, dukes, or grand dukes, each governing independently and enacting their own laws. The Kingdom of Prussia and the Austrian Empire were the two most powerful members of this confederation. However, both possessed territories and interests that extended far beyond the confines of the German sphere. Across this land, there were no unified tariffs, no common currency, no single legal system, and, most notably, no political institution capable of speaking on behalf of all German people. For the burgeoning German bourgeoisie, merchants, factory owners, lawyers, and professors, this state of fragmentation constituted a formidable obstacle to economic development. Yet, for German intellectuals steeped in the spirit of Romanticism, unification was an even deeper imperative, a cultural and emotional yearning. Schiller's poetry, Herder's philosophy, and the folk tales collected by the Brothers Grimm all contributed to the construction of a shared vision of a German nation. When news of the February Revolution in France arrived, the pent-up aspirations of years finally found an outlet for expression. The March storm, from the streets to the negotiating table. In March 1848, a revolutionary wave swept through the German states with astonishing speed. In the southern German states, including Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse, popular demonstrations compelled monarchs to appoint liberal figures to form new cabinets, a development historically known as the March cabinets. These new cabinets publicly pledged to advance constitutional reforms, safeguard civil liberties, and support the cause of German national unification. The most dramatic scenes unfolded in Berlin, the capital of Prussia, on March 18th, when the demonstrators learned that King Frederick William IV had agreed to reforms in principle. A thunderous roar of jubilation erupted. Yet, at this critical juncture, 2 gunshots shattered the crowd's joy. Whether an accidental discharge or a deliberate provocation, fighting immediately broke out. The citizens of Berlin erected hundreds of barricades in the streets, engaging in fierce combat with the Prussian troops sent to clear the area, a battle that raged until deep into the night. Early the following morning, the king ordered his troops to withdraw from Berlin. He personally removed his hat to pay his respects to the bodies of the fallen and appeared before the public wearing a black, red, and gold tricolor armband, a symbol of German unification. At the time, this constituted a stunning political gesture, an autocratic monarch bowing his head to the revolutionaries. At that moment, it appeared to be a historic turning point. German liberals and nationalists alike were jubilant. However, they perhaps failed to realize that Frederick William Ivy's concessions were more of a strategic retreat than a genuine political transformation. The army remained firmly in the monarch's hands, merely waiting for the opportune moment to strike back. St. Paul's Church, Frankfurt, the first experiment in democratic parliamentarianism in German history. On May 18, 1848, the most extraordinary political gathering in German history commenced at St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt, the first ever elected national parliament in Germany. 585 delegates from various states streamed into the hall, a group that included renowned historian Dahlmann, jurist Gervinus, and writer Ludwig Uhland, alongside countless doctors, lawyers, professors, and theologians. Some jokingly dubbed it a professor's parliament, a moniker reflecting its elite composition. This assembly bore the weight of every political ideal held by Germany's liberal intellectuals. Their mission was to draft a constitution for a unified Germany and to establish a democratic nation-state. Yet, the very first conundrum confronting them proved to be a vexing one. Exactly which territories should a unified Germany encompass? The Greater Germany solution advocated for incorporating Austria's German-speaking regions into the new state. Such a Germany would possess the most expansive territory and the largest population. However, the difficulty lay in the fact that Austria's German-speaking areas were inextricably linked to its vast non-German territories, and Austria's ruling Habsburg dynasty would certainly not readily consent to having its realm dismembered and absorbed into a new nation. The Lesser Germany solution, conversely, proposed excluding Austria and establishing a more compact North German nation-state centered on Prussia. While this approach was more practically feasible for many delegates, excluding Austria meant abandoning a vast number of German-speaking compatriots, a prospect that was emotionally difficult to accept. This debate dragged on for months. Meanwhile, the assembly was simultaneously tasked with addressing a series of thorny issues, including the Schleswig-Holstein question, a territorial dispute with Denmark, the Polish question, and the complex relationship between Czech and German ethnic groups, each of which entailed intricate conflicts of national interest. These protracted deliberations gradually eroded the political fervor and public patience that had characterized the early days of the revolution. The refusal of the crown, a historic crossroads. In March 1849, after nearly a year of deliberation, the Frankfurt National Assembly finally ratified the Frankfurt Constitution, declaring the establishment of a German empire with the King of Prussia serving as its hereditary emperor. A delegation traveled solemnly to Berlin to formally offer him the imperial crown. Frederick William Ivy's response went down in history as one of the most famous rejections of all time. He declared that he could not accept a crown picked up from the gutter, for in his view, the legitimacy of the imperial throne could derive solely from the mandate of Germany's sovereign princes, not from an elected assembly born of revolution. This refusal was not merely an act of personal arrogance. Rather, it reflected the fundamental aversion to democratic legitimacy held by Prussia's ruling elite at the time. Without Prussia's support, the Lesser Germany solution became impossible to implement. The authority of the assembly rapidly disintegrated. The monarchs of the various German states seized the opportunity to launch a counteroffensive, and the military once again reasserted control over the streets. Those radical revolutionaries who did not flee abroad, including the young Karl Schurz, who would later become a general in the American Civil War, either languished in prison or lived in exile in foreign lands. The revolutionary experiment of the Frankfurt National Assembly thus came to an end. The legacy of revolution, a gift from the defeated. However, to simply characterize the German Revolution of 1848 as a failure constitutes an overly simplistic historical judgment, viewed through a broader historical lens. The legacy of this revolution runs far deeper than it might appear on the surface. The constitutional text drafted by the Frankfurt Parliament, particularly its section on the fundamental rights of the German people, constitutes a remarkably visionary political document. Its contents enshrine fundamental principles such as personal liberty, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and equality before the law. Although this text never officially entered into force, it became deeply embedded in the collective memory of Germany's political intellectuals and was frequently invoked in later years. Indeed, the drafters of West Germany's 1949 Basic Law consciously drew inspiration from the political legacy of 1848. More importantly, the constitutional ideals and the consciousness of national unity that spread widely across Germany in 1848 provided the indispensable social foundation and political legitimacy for the subsequent unification by blood and iron spearheaded by Bismarck. Germany did, after all, achieve unification, though the manner and path taken differed starkly from those envisioned by the liberals of 1848. Dear viewers, that concludes this episode. We will continue to interpret for you the monumental changes that took place in several other European countries during the revolutions of 1848. Thank you for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time.